we're going to get started. Those handouts will kind of pass out here shortly once they arrive. So my name is Todd Schweider. I am the Diagnostic and Customer Service Manager is my official title. I got a degree in horticulture from BYU-Idaho. And then I've been in the industry 10 plus years, working at several different garden centers. My favorite part of my job is I sit at this front desk and I help people with their plant problems. I'm sometimes I feel like I should put out like one of those long cushion like those and have like do a plant therapy session every once in a while. But so I enjoy teaching. I enjoy being here. So thank you for coming. We're going to be kind of going over seeds. So kind of what I would like, kind of how to plan it, like how to plan, how to read a seed packet, kind of the ins and outs of the basics ins and outs of seeding, of doing seeds, and then kind of that process to transplant, and then some seeds you don't want to start indoors, you want to just do straight outdoors, and kind of how that process goes and how I like to think. The thing I like to tell people about gardening is the seed, like as far as seeding and germinating, the seed has everything it needs in that seed. Okay. And they are a lot more efficient than we are at it. Okay. And so really you can make it as simple as putting seeds in dirt and most likely they'll grow. Okay. You don't have to, but there are some complications, and if you want to be more efficient at it and have a better germination rate and have better success, yes, there's more things you can do to help that seed go on, but really the seed doesn't need us. They have everything they need in that seed to grow, to produce, to do things, okay? So as far as growing the plant, in general, they will do it for you, and so you can be as simple as you want, or you can do the science and you can really plan it out to a T and have like this weekly, like I'm going to do this and I'm going to be really diligent. I'm going to keep a garden journal and I'm going to keep track. You can go to that extreme too. And everyone's different. So gardening can be very, it can accommodate to your level of meticulousness or free-flowing as you want it to be, okay? And so that's one thing I like about gardening is that it can fit a lot of different personalities and it can just be fun. But also if you're into that, you can get really into the weeds and really go at it. So I have some examples here that will kind of go through that. But the first thing that I like to talk about when seeding is more of having a plan, okay? Because you can grab a tray, you can throw seeds in there, but if you don't necessarily have maybe an end goal or what you want out of your garden, then it might not accomplish the desire of what you're growing. Here, can you hand me one really quick? And some of these things that you kind of may want to consider when you get this handout, we kind of have make a plan, questions to consider. Okay, things can be like what does your family like to eat? Okay, my dad would always grow like turnips and things like that. I didn't really like turnips. It's like, and so then we would end up having like this bushel of turnips that we never really used. And so there's part of that, like talking with your family. How big of a family do you have? Are you growing too much of something that you end up not using, but not enough of something else? Kind of understanding what the dynamics of your family so you can make sure you grow enough and you're not overseeding. How much space do you have to work with? Do you have a 10 by 10 foot garden space that you can do a big garden, or are you just on a patio growing in your pots kind of thing? Like what kind of space are you dealing with? Will you be growing just for fresh eating, Or are you going to be growing for cooking? Or are you going to be growing for canning? Are you going to be growing for preservation, to preserve vegetables and things like that? Because obviously, if you're going to preserving, normally you want a cash crop where you have like a lot all at once so that you can have enough produce to actually can or to dry. Where if you're just wanting to eat as you go, then maybe a succession planting is the way to go so that you have that vegetable or fruit throughout the season that you can eat and cook with, but you don't have like that main big crop all at once. Zucchinis are a classic example. It's always like, or cucumbers, where they're like, all of a sudden your church or your community, they're like, people are just giving them away because they can't seem to use them fast enough. And that's when you get all your zucchini bread and all that, because they've grew 4 or 5 plants and then they can't keep up with what they're growing. And some people want to make pickles, and so they want that cash crop, but other people, they just wanted that one cucumber, that fresh cucumber to eat, but now they have 20 of them that they can't seem to deal with. So kind of taking some of those kind of ideas in count. Now, part of this, if you were a new gardener, obviously there's trial and error a little bit to this, where, oh, I planted 3, I didn't need 3, I only needed to plant 1. But one year I planted 1 and it didn't do too well, so maybe I'll plant 2 just so I have a backup. So there's a little bit of trial and error. There's a little bit of kind of getting used to what you want out of your garden. So that's the kind of the first thing that I like to talk about. Other things is kind of you can, like, after you kind of think of some of those questions, other things that I like to kind of ask is, why am I growing? Some people are very motivated to grow for a garden, like to actually eat. Some people, like my father-in-law, he just wanted to see things grow. And then when it got to the harvesting time, he didn't really care. Like, he just wanted to have that beautiful garden and to kind of show off. But then when it came to the produce, it was like, whatever. He got something here and there, but he just wanted that greenery. And that is totally fine, in my opinion. If you want to go that route, then there's some plants that just, like pumpkins, just grow massive and big, and they can be really fun. But tomatoes and like other, like brassicas, they always get like aphids are a really big problem with brassicas. And so it's always like, sometimes I always have a hard time with those. I grow them, they look amazing, but then I'm always dealing with aphids. So you can kind of find what you want out of it. One of my favorite things to do is just do like a salsa garden, because then I have a purpose in mind. I don't just have random vegetables that I'm growing, and then it's like, okay, they start to produce, like, what am I going to do with this? If I have a salsa garden, I know I have peppers, I have tomatoes, I have some hot peppers, I have some sweet peppers, I have maybe some different herbs, chives, things like that, that I know that I can harvest all that and I can make something with it. So then I have like a purpose behind my garden. I really like to garden in that way, so that I have something to kind of focus my directions in. And then I find that I have a more fulfilling experience with the gardening versus, oh, I grew everything under the sun, and then I get overwhelmed, and then I get frustrated with gardening, and then it kind of overshadows the enjoyment that I usually get out of it. So I really like, that's for me. I like to kind of do a themed garden. Some ideas: salsa garden, salad garden, barbecue garden. So corn, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, things like that. Italian garden, especially if you're into making your own like red sauce, for things like that. An Asian garden is a great idea. Victory garden, which is kind of a fun, I don't know if you've ever heard of a victory garden from World War I, World War II. That's kind of the bread and butter. Like, that's what, when people think of gardening in America, our roots go back to Victory Gardens, which is like the row gardens, and it's like the cabbages, and we're slowly breaking away from this mold that was created from World War II of how we can garden, kind of thing. But so there's some fun things there. So that's where that's where you kind of need to start, is kind of looking at what do you want to grow? What do you want to see? Choosing your crops, selecting a garden can be a way to help choose what you want to grow, to kind of do that. And I'm just going to put this out there. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and I'm willing to ask. I just want to put that out there, that this isn't just me lecturing. If you have questions, please ask. So that is where that's where I like to start, so that I start with a good plan, so then I end up with a better plan. I end up better at the end. Now, as far as choosing your crops, is also, we live in Utah, okay? Utah is considered upper mountain, west kind of climate. We're also a desert, okay? This year was pretty mild for snow and moisture per se, but we still were really cold, okay? And normally our last frost date in general, you can always kind of look up city by city, because there is some nuance depending on where you live. But in general, our last frost date is around Mother's Day, okay? So if you're from California or somewhere else, that's going to be a lot further back than what maybe you're used to. And as we get into planting our seeds, I'm going to kind of skip over select crop combos. That's just another way, like a way to kind of narrow down what you want to grow, because some crops kind of go over combos. But I'm going to kind of jump straight into well, actually, let me just kind of briefly over that. Select combos, that's again, some plants have some combinations. I don't want to go in too much detail, but that's just something to be aware of. Plants do have combination planting that you can kind of be better. So some examples, like carrots and tomatoes supposedly go really well together, and they can kind of help. I've heard of people growing like corn, and then they'll do green beans like pole beans or peas, and they'll use the corn to kind of grow up, so then the stalks grow, so then you can kind of utilize your space more efficiently and get more out of it. That's like it's a whole nother topic that we could go into really depth in, so I don't want to go in too strong of a depth about that. But there's that thing, and then obviously planning your garden space, options like raised beds, container gardening, vertical gardening, things like that, that may affect how early or late you can start your seeding process. Things in pots tend to dry, or in raised beds tend to get warm faster, so usually you can seed in them sooner, versus if you're planting in your ground, that ground tends to stay colder longer. And so then maybe you can't plant as early. So there's kind of like understanding what you're dealing with may adjust the needle of when you start planting or start things. And we're going to kind of go into the germination here soon, just to kind of go into more of that depth. But those are things that you can kind of take into account a little bit. And like I said, gardening, I always like to tell people, gardening is a science, and there's a lot of trial and error. So just because you had a fail this year, you can kind of adjust and figure out what you need to do for a better success the following year. And hopefully that's why we're here at Glover Nursery. Hopefully if we can help educate and get you having better success faster, instead of going through the 10 years that I went through to try to figure all this out. So yeah, so those are planning your procedure. And then we'll go over number 5 here in a second, because that's going to be kind of talking about extending your season and stuff like that. Because we live in a cold climate here, we want to extend our season with like greenhouses or whatnot like that potentially. But do you have to do that? No. But we'll go over that. But let's jump into seeding now, because I think that's the main bread and butter that we're here for today, is the seeding. What I want to kind of talk about first is the day that we base all of our planning around, and that is our last frost date, which, like I said, is usually around Mother's Day. Whether you believe in global warming or not, sometimes it feels like it's starting a little earlier, depending on where you live. Places like Saratoga Springs, since they're right, the lake effect, if you will, they tend to warm up a little faster versus if you're up against the mountains here. But then usually maybe your last frost date's a little later. So depending on but if you're like, oh, I'm just going to be an easy gardener, then you can just make Mother's Day as a pretty safe bet in general. Okay, that you can do that. You can always get on the internet, Google or any other website. Usually if you just say, what is my last frost date, average last frost date for Utah in West Jordan or wherever, normally you can get maybe a more precise date to start. But that's where we want to put that's where we plan, is based off of that day. Okay. Yeah.
So if anyone uses QR codes, we did put a QR code here for USU Extension Services, which has a breakdown by city of Utah. So it will be very specific for everyone's individual.
So right here on that paper. So if you want to get those specifics, you can click at that and it'll take you to there. So that's where we're going to plan our base off. Now, the next step when you're getting a seed is, again, you kind of want to determine, is it a cool season crop that I'm working with, or is it a warm season crop that I'm working with? So some examples of cool season crops would be lettuce, peas, beans, can kind of be in that cool season crop. Most of the brassicas, such as like, my brain just went blank, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, things like that can sometimes usually fall into that cool season crop. Okay, and then your warm season crops are usually things such as peppers, tomatoes. Those are probably the classic. Watermelons, melons in general are usually considered warm crop. Most squashes usually need a hot season to really do well, especially the winter squash, because they don't produce until winter, so they need that whole summer to kind of grow in that heat. So those are usually more on the warm season. Now, why are they called cool season and warm season beyond the cool? It's not just beyond, but the main thing is cool season crops can grow in cooler weather, where warm seasons need that warmer weather. But it's not just weather, it's also soil temperature. So the cool season crops can germinate in cool season soils. So they don't need to be as warm. Where for tomatoes example, they usually need a soil temperature at least around 65 for ideal germination. And things like that. So they need a warmer soil. So if you put them outside too early, if you try to plant them directly in the ground outside and the soil is too cold, then that seed is just going to sit there until the soil is warm enough to germinate. Okay, so that's why you have the two categories, cool season and warm season. So now if you buy seeds, not all seeds are the same. As far as the information they give you. Some companies just say lettuce, and they say the variety, but then they don't give you any information of like when to plant, when to transplant. And so then you have books that you can buy that can kind of help you determine that. But the seeds that we have, I really like Botanical Interest because they give you some really good information to help you plan whether you can plant it outside or whether you need to plant it indoors and when you can do that. Okay, so this is a lettuce, which is usually a cool season crop. And on the Botanical Interest ones, They usually have one to sow outside and one to start inside. And because it's a cool season crop, on it says one to sow outside, it says recommended. You can grow this in a pot indoors if you wanted to. It's totally fine. But because it's a cool season crop, they recommend, instead of putting this in a seed tray, just put it straight outside into the ground. And it says recommended 2 to 4 weeks before your average last frost date, and when the soil temperature is at least 40 degrees, ideally 60 to 7, but it can germinate as low as 40 degrees, it says on the back here. And then and then it goes into other details that you can kind of incorporate if you want. So according to this seed packet, this grass there, or this lettuce, you take your last frost date, which will say Mother's Day, and then you would go 2 to 4 weeks before Mother's Day, and that's when you can plant outside, because it can handle that colder weather and still germinate and still start doing something. So then that saves you space indoors, saves you time of transplanting it eventually outdoors and stuff like that. Another example, so that one's 2 to 4 weeks. Peas are a really nice one. These are, again, it says 1 to sow outside, recommended for outside, and it says 4 to 6 weeks before your average last frost date, when the soil temperature is at least 40 degrees, ideally 60 to 80. Okay, now this comes into that spectrum. Do you want to be an easy gardener who doesn't really do all the detail work and just hope it grows? Or do you want to be the extreme, like, I'm going to check every thing off my box? Like, you can get a soil thermometer and check the soil temperature and find that right time when it's the right temperature at 40 degrees or higher, and then sow it, and then you will probably have a better germination rate. That is true. Or I totally am fine with this. You can go the easy route, which is like, it's, according to this says 4 to 6 weeks before your average last frost date. We're about 6 weeks away from Mother's Day right now, essentially. You could just go throw these in the ground and they would probably grow here soon. They would probably start that germination process to get going. Okay, so again, this cool season, they can germinate at that lower temperature, as low as 40 degrees, and still germinate. They like that cool weather. Now, it does say that they will germinate better or faster at 60 to 80 degrees. But they'll still start at 40. So if you want to get that early crop going, you can plant these cool season. Yes, actually, so legumes, which a pea is a legume. Legumes have a special, like, characteristic, if you will. They like to fix nitrogen in the soil. But because of that, they also have, their seeds have, I can't think of the scientific terms and whatnot, but the seeds do have this ability of soaking in nutrients before they start germinating. And so a lot of people will soak their legume seeds, like peas, in like what do they call it? I just lost the name. What? An inoculant, that's the word. They'll do an inoculant. They'll inoculate the seed, which is usually a really low amount of nitrogen that will soak into the seed, preparing it, and then it tends to have a stronger kind of start. Do you have to do that? No. Does it help the seed? Do you usually get a better crop? Yes. I have 2 seed inoculants. This one has a little bit of nitrogen in it, but it's actually, this is nitrogen fixing, and it has this azrophyllum, which is a really good product that this is more of a powder, but I think you mix it with water, and then you could soak your legume seeds in it, like peas. So this is a new product that I have. This also works for transplanting, if you to help the seeds transplant, if you're one you grow in a tray into a pot. So I really like that product. I also have this seaweed extract that I like to soak my legumes in. On the back, it says seed treatment and inoculant. Mix 2 ounces extract in 1 gallon of water. soak seed briefly. You don't want to soak them too long because or else you might kill the seed. But you're just trying to help it briefly pull in some of that nitrogen, that low nitrogen, and then it gives it a boost. Now, like I said, yeah, you can. People have done studies, research on it, and you can do that, and it does produce usually a better crop. But again, you can also be the relaxed gardener, and you can just throw them in the ground, and they, in general, should do just as fine. Maybe you won't produce as quickly or as readily, but in general, they'll do just as fine. So you can kind of go what extreme you want to do. Experiment. Gardening is just a big experiment half the time. So so you can kind of do things. But we do have these two products here for legumes, like peas. I also, another little quick tip about peas is because it's a legume, they fix nitrogen in the soil. So my uncle, who was next door, my dad always told me, he's like, I'm going to do that this year, but then he would never do it. But my uncle was really good at doing this. He would do his entire garden in peas. He would grow them because he would start them that as early as possible. He would, I don't know if he checked the soil temperature, but he at least did the 6 week. Maybe he checked the soil temperature on like warm springs like we're having this year, because maybe that 40-degree temperature in the soil might even be earlier than 6 weeks before our average last frost. But he would plant it as early as possible. He would do his entire garden, and then this would grow. He would usually get one harvest out of it, and then he would rototill it into the ground and then plant his normal garden on top. So then he would help fix that nitrogen into the ground, and then he would then do his normal gardening for the second wave of cool season gardening, and then leave room for the warm season crop. So he would usually get a crop of this early in the spring, and then that would help get nitrogen in the soil. He would rototill it in to kind of get that biomass of the seeds into the ground, and he would usually have pretty good gardens. So that was a technique that you can do with peas. Because they grow so early and in cool temperatures, you can do that. Okay. Other plants that normally you want to plant directly in the ground, they're all like this. Says this is carrots. It says recommended outside 2 to 4 weeks before your average last frost date. So again, 2 to 4. This one was 4 to 6, so this one's even earlier. These ones were 2 to 4, so they can't handle as cold as the peas, but they're still on the cooler side to germinate. But the other thing you want to kind of know about things like carrots or potatoes, those root vegetables, radishes are also usually considered a cool season crop. Those kind of plants you want to, usually you don't want to plant those in a seed tray, just because that root system, because it's a root vegetable, they just, it's usually not convenient to grow, because if you grow it in a tray, depending on how long early you grew it, then maybe it has a hard time transplanting because it's dealing with that root system. That root system sometimes gets stunted and things like that. So normally I recommend planting root vegetables directly outside instead of growing them in a seed tray. So root vegetables usually want to go directly outside. Now I kind of talked a little bit about this brand just to kind of show a different brand here. This one is the detail, or the details are a little different. They don't quite give the same, like, oh, recommended outside or recommended indoors. So there's other, like this one says start indoors 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost date. So this one says, even though it's a brassica, they're recommending planting it indoors first, even though it can handle a cool season, but maybe the seeds can't germinate in a cool season. So that's why they are often considered a fall crop, because they can handle the cold, but they can't necessarily germinate in the cold. Again, these are just little nuances that you'll pick up as you're gardening. But again, either get books or read the seed packet. So the first thing, and then we have things kind of like warm season crops. It says for when to sow outdoors, it says for mild climates, 2 to 4 weeks after your average last frost date. So if we were to plant it after our average last frost date, we would be doing 2 to 4 weeks after Mother's Day about. And so we're starting a lot later, okay? And we'll talk about the implications of that here in a second. So that's because you're waiting so far after the last frost date. Normally people will plant warm season crops in a seed tray to get them started earlier, where it's warmer indoors or in a greenhouse or something. And then once it's warm enough outside to transplant it, you can transplant it outside, kind of thing. So this one, it says one to start inside, recommended 8 to 10 weeks before transplanting. Okay, not before your last frost date, but before transplanting. So that's another little key point that you need to keep in mind. Sometimes it'll say, depending on the instruction you're reading, sometimes it'll say before the last frost date, but sometimes it'll say before transplanting. So you're not transplanting on Mother's Day because it's still too cold, okay? Even though that's our last frost date. Normally you're transplanting this after Mother's Day. So it's not from that, but you're still going to use that last frost date as kind of your guide of when you're going to transplant. And then once you find out when you're going to transplant, then you can say, I'm going to do 8 to 10 weeks before that date. And then it says, ideal soil temperature for germination is 70 to 90 degrees. Okay, this cannot germinate in 40-degree temperatures. It can't even germinate in 60. It needs that soil temperature to be 70 to 90. So if you, yeah?
If you're doing this in a greenhouse, and if you're doing something like that, would it be best to use one of those heating tray things?
Yes.
Because the temperature needs to be so warm for those.
Yeah, if you do not have a heated greenhouse, then maybe a seated tray would be good. Or if you're doing it indoors, even if your outside temperature is 70 degrees, like your house is around 70. Like if you're like me, I always put mine more at 65 during the night kind of thing. So it kind of gets deep. It may not like it as much. So that's when those heated trays can come in really handy. So for those who don't know, I don't have one here with me, but you can buy these trays that you put underneath these, and you hook it into a wall, and it radiates heat. And so then it kind of heats that soil, it heats the water in the soil to bring that temperature up to the desired temperature. Again, depending on how nuanced you want to get, you can always get a soil like a soil thermometer, kind of check that temperature, make sure it stays at the temperature you want it. Sometimes people like to get one of those, those timers that you use for your Christmas lights, and they'll kind of dial it in so that it turns on at certain times of the day, but turns off so it's not like always on, making it too hot. But as far as tomatoes go, it's pretty hard to get too hot of a soil temperature. But there are some, you can, like I said, gardening is kind of trial and error. You can go into the weeds, or you can just plant it and hope for the best. And normally, like I said, the seed has all the engineering done from thousands of years in that seed to do its own thing, and most likely will probably grow by itself. You don't have to go all this, but if you want to give it that boost, you want to get it growing faster, then those are techniques that you can help to have better success. So yeah. So this is a pepper, 70 to 90. Tomatoes are similar. They prefer a higher temperature. Like this one doesn't say a temperature on the back for the Livingston. I just know that they also like to be similar. So those are, some seed packets give you a lot of details, some seed packets don't. So you just kind of have to figure some of those out. Now, the next thing that I would recommend when you're looking at a seed packet, most seed packets, both of these show it, they have days to germination. Okay, so this one says, this is a tomato, it says 7 to 10 days to germinate, days to germination. This is a pepper that says days to emerge. So that's the same thing, to germinate or to emerge. It says 10 to 25 days. That is how long, once you put the seed in the correct temperature. So for these ones, since they are warm season crops, they need that 70-degree temperature. Once that soil is 70 degrees, it takes 10 to 25 days for this pepper to germinate. okay, for what we call the embryo. What is it? The little first, the initial flower. Cotyledon. Thank you, cotyledon. So the first leaf that comes out is called the cotyledon. It's not a true leaf. It looks like a leaf, but it's not a real leaf. It's called the cotyledon. For that first kind of cotyledon to fully emerge and for the plant to maybe start sending out true leaves, usually takes that days to emerge. Okay, so and so that's how long. So if you put it if you grow it outside or you grow it in a tray, it's good to keep that in mind, because I've seen people like, oh, I put my peas on one side and then I put my tomatoes on another side, and my peas are already up. My tomatoes must have died. No, not necessarily. Like these peas here, it says 5 to 10 days to emerge, where this tomato is 7 to 10 days to emerge. So maybe they should germinate at the same time, but maybe they won't. And also and things like that. Also, this one takes 10 to 25 days. So this is going to be a whole week after the tomatoes to germinate potentially. So you just have to kind of be aware of that time to emerge or to germinate. Yeah.
How moist should you
I'm going to get over that in a second. I'm going to continue on reading the seed packet, and then I'm going to get into more of the details on seeding. But that's to emerge. Now, the next thing that you want to look when you're looking at a seed packet or determining what seeds you want to grow is you want to look at maturity. Okay, so for example, this pepper says it takes 75 days from transplant to grow. Okay, that's from transplant. Sometimes they won't say transplant. Sometimes it'll just say 75 days maturity kind of thing. These carrots, for example, says 65 days to mature, but it doesn't say from transplant. It just says 65 days to emerge, or 65 days maturity, not to emerge, maturity. This one says 62 to 75 days. Okay. Now, normally, in most cases, this pepper might be in a little bit. The pepper and tomato might be a little bit of a nuance to this, but if I was to grow this outside, let's say today, and the soil temperature was at least 40 degrees, my guess is that if it's at 40 degrees, it's going to take longer to germinate, so it's going to be more on that 10-day, where if the soil's 60 degrees temperature, it's probably going to be more on the 5-day germination rate. So that's at least 10-ish days. Let's say 10 days, okay? Then adding to that 10 days, it's going to take 62 days to 75 days before I can get fruit, because that's how long it takes to mature. So that's like a month, 2 months, 62 days, so about 2 months-ish before I get before I can harvest. Okay, so if I start it today, 10 days, that's a week, and then I have 2 months before I can get a harvest. So if you are like, I have time in the spring to do my vegetables or canning, or I have a big event, or I want these vegetables ready by a certain time, you can kind of do that backtracking where you're like, okay, I want it to harvest today, this day, let's say July 1st. Okay, I need 2 months before July 1st. Then I need 10 days before transplanting. So this is when I need a transplant. And then you can get into that detail if you want to kind of plan it out. So you'll see a lot of seed trays. I don't see it on that. You'll see a lot of examples of like people doing Excel sheets where it kind of like, I start this day so I can harvest this day, and you can go into the details and into the weeds a little bit if you want to. So that's a good thing to know. Now, when it comes to warm season crops, the reason why that's really important is because this tomato says it takes 80 to 96 days to mature. If I waited to plant it directly outside in the ground, I would have to wait until the soil temperature was at least 70 degrees. Okay, so that's at least 2 to 4 weeks after Mother's Day. Okay, And then if I plant it in the ground, it takes 7 to 10 days to emerge. And then it will take at least 80 to 9 to 100-ish days from that after emergence before it produces fruit. That's probably going to put me into September, October. Is it going to stay warm enough for this plant to still be producing fruit at that time? So that's why in cool season climates like we have in Utah, they recommend to plant your warm season crops in a seed tray, like according to this, 75 days before transplant. So again, so transplant's usually 2 to 4 weeks ish, or when that soil is about 60 degrees temperature. That's one I'm gonna transplant. So I need to do 6 to 8 weeks. So then it already had 6 to 8 weeks to kind of do something to kind of help lower that maturity time, that mature before. So then hopefully it'll start producing fruit before it gets too cold, and then I can get a good harvest out of it. And then you actually can have a nice July tomato in July on your barbecue with your hamburger instead of waiting till October or September to eat that tomato. Okay, yeah.
So it seems like July gets so hot, July and August, it seems like they don't.
Yes.
Is
That is true. So there, like everyone knows about like winter dormancy, but plants often, a lot of plants will go into a heat dormancy. Usually it's above 95 degrees. Plants will go into a heat dormancy. Usually peppers and tomatoes won't. They can, especially if we're starting to get into those 100 degrees, but they really like it warm. But things like your brassicas or your lettuces or those more cool season crops, those are more likely to go into a heat dormancy when it gets really hot. So most of the time, that's why kind of my example about the peas, my uncle grows them, harvests them, and then grows a new crop because he doesn't want to keep those peas through the hot season. Because they tend to kind of go dormant. They tend to struggle. They don't do as well in that heat. So that is part of planning your garden a little bit, is like, okay, what do I want to grow? When I list down all the vegetables I want to grow, are most of them cool season crops? If that's the case, then plan accordingly to make sure you're harvesting maybe before that really hot weather comes. Try to plan it accordingly. Are you doing more of a salsa garden that likes that heat? Then maybe you can plan accordingly, and maybe you're fine growing through that hot season. But yeah, like last year, I did have a lot of people. Was it last year? Yeah. Or was it the 2 years ago? We had a really hot summer, and a lot of people's tomatoes did kind of just stop. And then ones that cooled down, they started kind of waking up and producing. That can happen. But at least but if you wait too long, then maybe they won't have enough time to get going again once that temperature kind of cools off a little bit. But that is true. That can happen. But that's kind of, any questions about seed planting where you use your last frost date and then you kind of go cool season, warm season. Do I plant it outside? Do I plant it indoors to make sure I have enough time to get a harvest from it and things like that? Any questions about that? What time is it? Yeah.
Well, back to the soil temperature.
Yeah.
You kind of guide like the temperature is going to be 70 or 80 degrees. Does that mean the temperature is going to accordingly come up?
Yeah. Yeah, as we warm up, obviously the soil is going to warm up too. The soil is usually cooler than the outside temperature in most cases. Now, it could be different, like if you're against like a brick fence or a brick wall or against like a vinyl siding where you get that reflective heat, maybe the soil is going to be different. And you could get a soil thermometer and maybe you could start earlier. But then like if you're against like a vinyl fence, when it gets really hot in July, then that vinyl fence is also going to maybe get even hotter. And so you kind of have to kind of balance that out a little bit. You might be able to start earlier, but then maybe they'll get scorched when it gets really hot with that reflective heat. kind of thing. So, but yeah, there are microclimates that can affect the soil temperature maybe differently than what's typical for that area. But in general speaking, as the temperature rises, soil temperature will rise with it, but it's usually a few degrees cooler than that. Now, the only other thing that I would maybe also or be cautious about is your nighttime temperature versus your daytime temperature. So just because it's 65 degrees today, this afternoon, we're still getting 32 degrees at night. So maybe the soil temperature is getting warm enough for, let's say, a tomato during the middle of the day, but at night it's getting below 40. Your seed is gonna struggle, because it's like, oh, I'm warm enough, I can get going. That seed starts to like wiggle, it starts to absorb water, but then it gets so cold at night that it's like, oh, it's too cold, I can't do anything. And then sometimes that stresses the seed out. It's going to lower that germination rate potentially, things like that. So did you have a question in the back?
Yeah, what time do you measure the temperature and what depth do you measure?
So as far as the depth is, it's where the seed is. Okay, a lot of these seeds are only 1/4 of an inch down. Okay, and so that top layer is going to be maybe more closer to the temperature of the day or night. Obviously, things like potatoes you put down deeper in the ground if you're doing from a seed potato, and so depending on temperature. Now, seed potatoes usually can handle colder temperatures and stuff. So it kind of depends on where you're putting the seed in the soil. And then it's also the consistency of that heat, kind of like the morning versus night. That's why seeding in trays can be really nice, because you can really keep that consistent heat, helping that germination process go quicker or more consistently, or just have a stronger plant in general, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask about watering, like the cool weather crops? Like in the day it's warmer and the night it's colder. My pipe, you know what I mean? Do I turn on my water?
Yeah.
What do I do with all that?
So that's, yeah. So we have April showers, and those are kind of nice to it's nice to kind of rely on those April showers a little bit, that early spring moisture, because things like peas and these cooler crops, because it's cooler temperature, they actually can, like, you don't have to maybe be as consistent with the watering to make them germinate. They'll probably do it by themselves in general. However, we are in Utah and we are a desert, so sometimes we have those heat spells or dry spells during the spring. Sometimes we don't have a really good moisture March or April, and so then maybe you need to go. Now, obviously, yeah, we might still get a freeze, and if you turn on your hose, you might have run into problems. So often, what I've done this before in the past, when I was a college student, I bought like a little community garden plot where I had my little 5x5 that I could do what I wanted with it, and it was too early to turn on their irrigation system, and so I'd go out with a bucket and just kind of like go and water them individually and things like that. But I would say in general, with the early morning water, like, obviously you're gonna have to kind of gauge that if you're doing direct sowing, because things for plants, seeds need heat or light from the sun, and water to germinate. Those are two things that it must have to germinate: heat, light, and water. And so if the seed is buried too deep, it won't germinate, because it might be too cold down deeper, or it may be not getting enough sunlight or that heat from the sun. Kind of thing. So you want to make sure it's at the right depth, and then it needs that water, because when a seed starts to germinate, it soaks in all this water. The seed kind of becomes a sponge, if you will, soaks in water, and then it sends up the cotyledon or whatever, to emerge, and then it goes from there into a normal plant. So it has to have that water to kind of soak in. So it definitely needs water if you're putting them out there, it's probably a good idea to at least water them out that first time when you're transplanting them. And then you can kind of gauge from the weather whether you need to go out and water it until it's warm enough to kind of get out there. Obviously, if a seed starts to germinate, like you water it, it starts soaking in that moisture. It starts trying to send up that cotyledon, but then it doesn't have enough water to keep it going. It's gonna die. Okay, it's gonna stop its growth essentially and die. So you don't want it to get. You don't want that to happen either. So you're trying to find that balance. But I've seen some people overwater, especially in seed trays. I see a lot of people overwater their seeds and end up killing their seeds from overwatering. Yeah. Any other questions about that? This is great. I love it. Okay. So those are kind of the basics for understanding the seed tray. You can, like I said, you can just plant it and just go from there based on like just reading off of the list. I'm going to maybe do that this weekend. My wife bought some pea seeds, and Saturday, I have Saturday off. I'm just going to go plant them. I'm not going to try to go into the weeds. I'm just going to plant them. But then if you really want to get in the weeds, you can make an Excel form. There's a lot of apps that do it for you, where you say, I want it to harvest on this day, or I want to plant on this day. And then it generates the other information for you on average of when you want to start.
Do you happen to have any recommendations on good apps?
No, I don't. I don't. Sorry. Do you have any recommendations on good apps?
I've used one called
Seed Time?
Okay.
and that one has been my favorite.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So there's a lot of different things that can kind of do the work for you, or you can do your own Excel and kind of fill it in. USU extension.
Very well-made chart, so you can just like tick it off as you go along.
And that's a local source, so it's more specific to Utah. So they have some really good resources there as well. I was going to, just as an example, this is Ball Red Book Horticulture book. It is like a industry book where it goes into the weeds on how to germinate things. So this is more for in a big, huge greenhouse. But just for example, it says sow seeds to a 512 plug tray onto a well-drained, disease-free germination medium with a pH of 5.5 to 5.8 at a low starting change. You can get into the weeds for these perfect seeds. Okay, so there are books if you want to get into the weeds. You can buy these books that have those. Okay, or like I said, you can. Yeah, that's what our growers do for the starts that we grow. They have it on this really strict schedule, when to fertilizer, when to do things like that. But let's kind of get into seed germination in general here. So we have, what we sell here is we have some seed trays, which are things like this. This one is without holes. Okay, this one is without holes. I have one here with holes right there. So that one is with holes. Now, if you have a greenhouse that you don't care that it drains onto the ground below you, then something like this, I usually recommend one with holes so that it doesn't trap that moisture and it has some good drainage. If you're in an indoor environment and you're wanting to grow things by seed indoors, I usually recommend more without holes because you don't want to mess on your kitchen table or things like that. I often recommend maybe a combination of these two. What I like to do is I will put like a pencil or a piece of wood or a piece of plastic or something that kind of goes just to raise it up a little bit. Put that in there, and then you get something kind of like this is a plastic seed tray. They come in different sizes. This is a jumbo 6 or a 6-pack. We also sell it in a 4-pack. We also have it in, if you want to go more environmental friendly, for these more paper-esque kind of ones that decompose better. But you kind of put something like that in there. You put your soil. Usually you want to pick some kind of seed soil. These are going to have better drainage, things like that. And then you put the soil in there, and then you can seed. But I like to do this double tray system with there, because then if I accidentally overwatered or there's a lot of moisture, I can then easily take this out, dump that down the drain or outside or something like that, so I don't overwater my plants, and then I can put it over here. If you don't want to do that system, that is totally fine. You can just put the seed tray straight into here. You just have to be a little bit more cautious of overwatering, because there's no place for that moisture to go away. Obviously, if you have a seed tray, you could try to pull these out to drain that tray, but these tend to be a little bit more flimsy and harder to kind of work with. So that's why sometimes I like to do that double tray system, in order to just make it more convenient to drain out if I overwater my plants. And then, because we're dealing heat, like we talked about, germination heat is very important for seeds. That's where these seed trays can come into handy. They're kind of like a little miniature greenhouse that can help trap in that heat when you're to kind of warm up that soil. And then what we talked about earlier, you can, if you want to go the 9 yards, you can add that bottom heat as well to keep your soil more evenly at the temperature you desire to what you're growing for tomatoes and whatnot. Obviously, the domes also help with humidity, because as those true leaves kind of grow, we're in a desert. Our indoor environments tend to not be as humid as outdoors, so sometimes humidity can be an issue. These domes can help trap in that humidity as well, to kind of help mitigate overwatering. So then you don't have to water as much, because it kind of keeps some of that humidity in. So domes can also be helpful. Do you need a dome? No, you do not. But it's just another tool at your disposal to help that seed germinate more consistently, if you will, or whatnot. So the dome can be helpful, but not necessary. Now, I do have 2 different sizes of domes. Like I have like a small one, but obviously the seed, you're going to have to take it off sooner. I have taller ones that can maybe be better for some vegetables. Sometimes you don't want that much humidity. You want to keep it tighter to the plant. Also kind of depends on what light source you're using. Obviously, plants need sun to grow, okay? They need that light. However, in an indoor environment, you may not have a good place. So you might be required to use like a grow light or something like that. Most grow lights, whether they're LED or fluorescent, they need, like for the seed itself, often growers will put that seed within about 4 inches of that seed for best germination rate, okay? To make sure, and that heat also helps keep that soil warm as well. And then as it grows, they keep it within 6 to 12 inches of the plant. So sometimes if you have a big dome, it's harder to get that light source close enough for best practices. Now, do you have to do that? Maybe not, but if you don't have enough light, it's just LEDs and fluorescent bulbs that are used for they just don't compare to the sun. And for the wavelengths are a good wavelengths for the plant, but they just don't have the oomph to go a long distance. And so you have to put the light bulb closer for the correct wavelengths to get to the plant to help the plant. So that's why you put it so close. So when you first get it going, I've seen people put them around 4 to 6 inches. And then as the plant gets bigger, then they'll kind of do more 6 to 12 inches away from the plant. But that's why you usually have to have it pretty close for those wavelengths to be strong enough to actually help the plant. So if you have like a room like this and you have like a bulb, like a fluorescent bulb, and you go to Home Depot and you get a plant fluorescent bulb and you put it in your ceiling, that is way too far away for your plants to get any benefit from it, okay? So you usually have to have it closer in order to have benefit for your seeds to germinate. There, you can buy some really fancy bulbs that have a longer range. You can get those, but then you're starting to spend hundreds of dollars on really fancy light systems. So if you want to go on the cheaper side, you just need to make sure it's closer. So I had a system at my old house where I had kind of like a little pulley system with a fluorescent bulb, and you want a full spectrum fluorescent bulb or LED lights, full spectrum, so you get all the wavelengths to kind of simulate the sun. You don't want just a warm light, because those tend to just be wavelengths that it's not the full wavelength that the plant needs. So make sure you have that full spectrum, and then you want it as bright as possible. The brighter the light, the further that light goes. So you want a really high wattage light system, and then put it as fairly close, and then you can and then I had a pulley system that I would kind of raise as I go as it grew. The other thing that I like to warn is some people are very ambitious when they get to seed planting. And so instead of following the seed, like doing the figuring out of like, okay, I need to start now so I can transplant at this time for like tomatoes, they start 10 weeks before the last, like they'll wait 11 or 10 weeks before Mother's Day or before the last frost date instead of before transplanting. And then they have like an extra 3-ish weeks that they're like, these plants are ready to transplant, but I can't because it's not warm enough outside yet, kind of thing. And so then they just leave them in the tray, and then they start getting root bound and they start having issues. And then when you finally get them out into the ground, they're stretched, they're root bound, and then you don't have as good of a seed start of a plant start to plant outside. So I really like to say, make sure you read the label, make sure you plant at the right time so that when it's ready to transplant, you're good to go. Because then, or else you run into this issue. Or the other issue I see is they start it in a tray and they have their whole kitchen tables taken up, we'll say, but they planted too early. And now the seeds are starting to get stretched, or they're starting to get too big for that. And so then they pot it up into something bigger. And then they pot it up into something bigger. And then they take more and more space in your kitchen. And then you're like, I don't know what to do with all these. And then you're waiting for that temperature to go right. And then that year happens to be a late winter, like we have a late spring. And then you can't get them out, and then you're like, what do I do with all these plants? So that's the other thing. I like to follow the instructions so that they're ready to plant when I need to, so I'm not dealing with this problem.
Is that way so often, at least when I start seeds before they get leggy,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm like, okay, now I don't know what to do with this.
So,
Is it gonna die on me, or
yeah,
what's going on?
leggy is usually mostly due to sun. Okay, not enough light.
Okay.
However, if they've been in that same pot too long and the root system is kind of crowded, but the thing is still trying to grow, they can get top heavy, and then they kind of fall over, and then they might, the stems might not be as strong as you need them to be when you transplant them outside, kind of thing. So that can potentially be an issue that you're running into as well.
That's my issue. So do you plan yours out to where you don't have to move them out of this?
That is my goal. I don't want to do that extra work of transplanting into a bigger pot and then transplanting that into a bigger pot. Obviously, if you're really into tomatoes, they're like, they have such a following. I wish I had a following like tomatoes did. But like people like baby their tomatoes so much that they do that and they get these huge tomatoes and they produce amazingly. So yes, you can do that. I'm a lazy gardener. I don't want to transplant or like bump it up, and then transplant it outside. I prefer to say, okay, this is when I'm going to transplant it outside. I need to do 4 to 6 weeks or whatever the seed thing says before that time so that it is just ready. I can just pop it straight into the ground. That's what I like to do, just to save myself some time and energy and space in my kitchen, or whatever room that you are putting it in. So, and then I usually find I have better results because then the plant is less stressed from all that potting up, and then I can just put it outside. Now, not saying you can't do that, and I've seen some really good results with people doing that, but that's just me. So, we talked about the dome, the seeding, and like I said, the seed has all the energy. You just put the seed in according to the right depth. A few things that I do like to mention about when putting soil in here. So whether you use something like this or a bigger pot or something like this, you want to make sure it is sanitized. So if you're using old pots, like last year's pots, make sure you sanitize them, clean them out as best you can, or else you're going to potentially have dampening off or other pathogens in your soil that make it hard for your seeds to germinate and grow. So if you use old pots, make sure. But I do not like to use outdoor soil. You can use a potting mix, but potting mixes often have soil in them, like outdoor soil as well, that can introduce pathogens. So I really like to use seed and cutting mixes because they tend to be, they drain well, they're not too heavy, so they allow the seeds to grow, the roots to grow out, and I just usually have better success when I actually use a seed and cutting mix. It's mostly peat moss, okay? It's mostly peat moss and perlite. That's pretty much all it is. There's no soil in it. There's maybe a little bit of limestone to adjust the pH, so it's at a good pH, but it's mostly just peat moss and soil. I don't want to put this in dry, even if it's a little moisture. I don't want to put it in dry and then water, because what happens is when you water it, it makes that soil heavy, and then it kind of compresses that soil. And that you don't want that. You want to keep it light and fluffy. So what I usually like to do is I like to put this in a container. I kind of add a little water, I don't want it dripping wet. If I take a ball and I squeeze it and it's dripping, I've put too much water in it, okay? I just want to put some moisture in there, get it a little hydrated so it's not like dry and dusty, because I don't want to like breathe in. That's just annoying. And then once I get it at that, moist but not too wet but not too dry, kind of that middle ground, then I like to go and put it in here. I don't want to do this because, again, that's going to make it settle, okay? And if you shake it, I'll maybe shake it a little bit just to kind of even it out. But again, you don't want to be too aggressive because, again, that's going to make it compress, okay? So I like to keep it nice and light. Maybe take like something and just kind of scrape off the excess, kind of like when you're doing flour and you kind of like take off the top. So it's somewhat level. I prefer to be a little bit below the line if possible, just so that when I water, the water kind of stays where I want it to stay and it doesn't just wash off the side. And then I will take the seed. Most seed packets will usually say the depth. This says a 1/2 inch. This seed carrot says about 1/4 of an inch deep. Like, obviously I wouldn't do seeds and carrots in here because it's a root, but just look at the seed and then kind of do that depth. If it's only like 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch where it's really little, then what I do is I just put it on top, and then maybe I'll get a little bit of this and just sprinkle it on top instead of trying to push it into the soil. Okay, now these techniques you can also use for your outdoor growing if you're planting directly in the ground. Obviously, usually your outdoor soil isn't going to be as light and fluffy. So it's maybe a good idea to amend your soil with some good compost, make it a lighter mix so it's easier for those seeds to germinate, so it's not as heavy, and things like that. So do that preparing if you're doing direct sowing. But again, read that label, see how deep. If it's only 1/4 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, instead of trying to do a little hole and put the seed in, it might be better just to kind of do the line or sprinkle it out and then get like a nice potting soil or something. Or Harvest Supreme is really good for that. Yeah, we have a product called Harvest Supreme that you can just kind of put on top to kind of get that 1/4, 1/8 of an inch coverage. Now, if it's a seed like peas that want to go a 1/2 inch, a whole inch down underneath the ground, then that's when I usually like prep like I kind of do a row or do a box, and I actually put holes in the ground and put it in the ground and grow it that way. So again, if you're direct sowing, do that. If you're growing in a seed tray, make sure you kind of do the seeds as well as needed.
Can I just
Yeah.
without drowning the seed.
Yes.
That's why we recommend a seeding mix, because it's designed to do that. Because you don't want the seed sitting in water; it'll rot.
Yep.
But you need moisture surrounding it for what Todd mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that is true. Yes. And that's also why that drainage is important. So if you wanted to do the double tray, so if you did accidentally overwater, there's not like a stagnant water at the base soaking into that soil, because you don't want that, because that will kill it, because kind of thing. So you're trying to find that balance there. Thank you. Yeah. That's just my notes about, sometimes I see people like pack it in, or they like shake it and then it gets heavier, and then that the consistency isn't ideal for seeding and have some issues.
I use that and I think of it as a nothing to do.
Exactly. Okay. Any questions up to now? Okay, sweet. Now, the next thing that you may need to be aware of when seeding, whether you, if you're outdoor seeding, you don't have to worry about this as much, because it's already adapted to the outdoor weather as it's been growing. But if you're growing indoor plants, like tomatoes, you've kept your house usually has a heating system. You've kept it at a fairly consistent temperature. If you've had that heat pad underneath it, you're keeping it warm and things like that. Okay. But then all of a sudden you're like, okay, it's ready to transplant outside. It's outside, you like may not be quite the same temperature, light source, light intensity as it is inside. Okay. And if you just put it straight outside in the sun, if it's cooler or hotter, then you may run into some issues where that plant freaks out, and it's like all of a sudden it's like gets scorched, or it gets frostbit, or it freaks out and it dies on you, or it kind of maybe it won't die, but it takes a lurch, and so then it takes time. It takes longer to kind of recover, and then that's going to extend the maturity time it takes for it to produce fruit. So if you have tomatoes and you've been doing all this work so you can get it out on time, so you have enough time for it to harvest, but then you put it outside and it gets shocked from that transition, then it might add a week or two as it recuperates to that end of your harvesting time. Okay, so we want to try to eliminate that, and that's what we call I have some notes here. I really like this book, just FYI. Western Garden Book of Edibles. Hardening off seeds. That's the word. I couldn't think of what it was called. Hardening off we're trying to harden off your seeds. Now, some techniques to do this is, obviously, if you're like, okay, tomatoes, it's still a little cooler outside, but I really need to transplant them outside. It's maybe it's a little early, but it's better to get them outside than to keep them indoors. I'm going to transplant them outside, but if you put it straight outside, they might shock the plant. So you need to harden them off. So often what that is taking it outside and putting it in like a shaded area for a few hours, then bringing it back inside at night. And then maybe the next day putting it back outside for 5 hours, 6 hours, then bringing it back inside for night. And you kind of slowly get it used to that light. The other thing is you want to get it used to not just the temperature, but the light. So you've been putting it in the shade, but every time you put it out, put it a little less in shade until it gets used to the sun, especially if you've been using like a grow light because you don't have enough sunlight in your house. If you use that grow light, make sure you transition it, because if the sun is going to be a lot more intense on the plant. So you need to make sure it gets used to that intensity so it doesn't shock it or burn the leaves or those kind of issues. Like obviously, if you're planting directly outside, you don't have to worry about that as much because they're just going to get used to that environment from the get-go. But if you're growing them indoors, putting them outside, then you have to worry about that a little bit. Some plant, like if you have a greenhouse, usually you don't have to worry about it as much, other than greenhouses are still like a warmer environment, usually because they trap in that heat. So you have to kind of still get it used to it a little bit. But hopefully if it's a nice greenhouse, you have good light in there. So hopefully the light transition isn't as devastating on it. But those are some things to consider, kind of hardening off your plants before you transplant them. So you can kind of incorporate that time of hardening off as part of your planning if you need to make sure you get it transplanted at the right time. So hardening off is an important thing to do. I was going to mention, because I'm almost out of time here, I just wanted to go over one major problem that a lot of people have when it comes to seeding, and that is a disease called dampening off. Okay, dampening off is usually a bacterial or a fungal disease or a mold. It's usually fungal or mold, not bacteria, fungal or mold disease that can usually bigger plants can handle these, can fight away these problems, but the small seeds with the cotyledon, like they tend to be really tender, and if this disease gets out of hand, it can cause dieback on your crop. Okay, some things to maybe be aware of is it's usually introduced with like either it usually comes from dirt. Okay, so that's why you want to use something like this, because this doesn't have any dirt in it. It doesn't have that pathogen. Most likely this is going to be a cleaner option than like getting like a potting soil that has dirt in it, or if you use your soil out from your garden. Those garden soils can have that the pathogens that promote this growth. Now, the other thing, the other things to be aware of is they thrive in cool, wet conditions. Okay, so if you're not using a dome, or if you're not using a heat tray, if the soil stays too cool, whether it's outside as well, it can happen outside as well. If you're germinating seeds and that soil is getting too cold, it can encourage this pathogen to grow and develop. So using keeping that soil at the right temperature for best germination is going to help combat dampening off. So if you've ever had dampening off problems, keeping that temperature at the right temperature can help with that. Also, like I said, it's introduced by soil. So if you have dirty hands, or if you use old equipment that have had soil in it before, or old pots, you might introduce dampening off into your system. So making sure you clean and sanitize can be really helpful. This product thrives in low light, overwatered, high salts, and cool soil temperatures. So again, the more, if you are using indoor like lighting system, that's why you want it really close. You want that bright light there to kind of help stave off dampening off and those kind of issues. You don't want to overwater. You're trying to find that nice balance, and then you want to clean supplies and stuff to do it. Now, it spreads really easy by water. Okay, so if you are growing and you notice some issues on one side of your tray and you water it, it could easily spread through the whole thing. So if you do notice dampening off, it's usually better to remove the diseased plants with the hope that you can kind of keep it in bay.
How does it look? Does it look like, is it just the brown on the end of the tips of the hairs?
No, so normally it some signs of it. Let me see here. I thought it talked about it's usually a fungus or a mold. Seedlings fail to emerge from the soil. The cotyledons, which is the first leaf, the seedling stems are water-soaked, soft, mushy, and may be discolored, gray or brown. Seedling stems become water-soaked and thin, almost thread-like, where infected. So often you'll see, like, you'll have this nice plant, but then as you look at the stem, it's like all withered kind of looking. That's a good sign that you have dampening off. Young leaves wilt and turn yellow, brown, or gray or brown. So if it does actually have true leaves on it, it'll kind of go brown. Roots are absent. Fluffy white cobweb looking kind of fungus growing on your soil. So those are kind of the symptoms. That's just that is a common problem. The other common problem people have when seeding indoors is fungus gnats. Fungus gnats aren't necessarily detrimental to your seedlings, but they just fly around there knowing, and that's an indication that you are overwatering, because they like to lay their eggs in fungus. And so if you, that's why they're called fungus gnats. Okay. And so those are some issues. The only other thing I was going to talk about seeding, whether you are seeding indoors or you're seeding your plants outside, you do not want to fertilize until they at least have 2 true leaves. Okay, so the first leaf is not a true leaf. That's the cotyledon. But then it'll send out a leaf, and then it'll send out a second leaf. Once those 2 leaves are there, then you can fertilize with an actual fertilizer, whether you want to fertilize them in the here or if you want to fertilize them. This one is this blooming rooting soluble. This is a water soluble. It has a really high middle number, so that promotes root growth and development. This one would maybe be a good option for like seed train, because you can mix it in your water. Sometimes I'm a little nervous going too strong too fast. So things like something more mild, like this one is a really good one for seedlings. Outdoor growing, you can kind of put fertilizer in the ground first when you're prepping the soil. You can do that, but if you wanted, but I wouldn't do any major, if you are planning on doing other fertilizing beyond the initial, like prepping your plot, then I would not, you would want to wait until at least you see the 2 true leaves on the seedling. And then I want to just mention, actually, we'll bypass that. The only thing I missed is transplanting outside. Once you harden off, you can transplant. We're in Utah. So if you want to transplant sooner than like, oh, I can't wait till 2 to 4 weeks after Mother's Day to transplant, that's when you can do things like hot caps. So it's like a little greenhouse that you put around, and it helps heat that soil, helps keep it warmer, so it's a warmer temperature. So that's a cheap version. We also have things kind of like these walls of water. I like to, one way, a tip and trick is you have a plant. Let's say this is my plant right here. I put the bucket around it, and then I take this with the holes up, and I put this around it, and then it kind of holds it up for you. So the plant's in there, I planted it, I put the bucket on, then I fill this up with water, and then I can remove the bucket, and it kind of folds in on itself like a teepee, and then it holds. So then you're not like trying to like hold it as you're trying to put water in it. So that's a really good little tip trick. But this can allow you to plant earlier to make sure you have enough time. Now, if you really wanted to maybe direct sow a tomato outside, you could maybe try to do this system around it, but that's still kind of iffy, like whether it's going to produce soon enough for you. But yeah, any last questions? I think we're going to wrap it up here, but we'll go for questions.
I have raised beds. I cannot grow zucchini. I have beautiful plants, but I never have zucchini.
Okay.
And the same with my cucumbers.
Yeah, so cucumbers and zucchinis have male and female flowers. And so my guess is you're running more into an issue of pollination, or your plants are only producing male flowers. And a lot of those plants, they will first produce male flowers to attract bees, and then they'll produce female flowers in order to get to pollinate. So those first flowers aren't going to do anything. And then it's the second flowers, and maybe you're not getting the second flowers. I can show you a few products that could maybe help promote that. That could also be an issue of too much nitrogen. So nitrogen promotes leaf growth, but not necessarily flower growth. And so something like this with that high number is going to promote more flower growth. So you could fertilize with something kind of like this, and maybe that'll promote more growth. And then I also have a hormone that you can spray on zucchinis and other plants to help promote more flowering as well.
I have
So-
lots of flowers.
Yeah, it might, like I said, they're all male flowers. Yeah, they might all be male flowers, and so you're not getting those female flowers to kind of get it to, because the females are the ones that produce the fruit. So, but we could talk in more detail here in a second. Any other questions? Oh yeah.
I hear people say you need to rotate your crops.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, don't plant tomatoes in the same spot.
Yep.
My dad always grew with his tomatoes
In the same spot.
and he had
Yeah.
tons of stuff.
So the main reason is there are some pests and diseases that, let's say you have the tomatoes in the same spot, if a disease or a pest finds that and they winter over, and then you plant in the same place and you winter over, that population can get worse and worse and worse to a point where it's hard to grow a plant. Okay. Is that going to happen all the time? No, maybe not. And if you have a really small garden, you don't have the options of rotating crops, then I guess you're not going to rotate crops. But then you have from year to year, you have a higher risk of maybe a disease or an insect infestation if you plant in the same place. So it's just a tool to use to rotate crops to try to minimize that risk of a disease or a fungal problem happening in the soil or on the plant.
So it's not necessarily a situation where you're depleting specific nutrients.
There is a little bit of that. There's ways around that, but that's not the main reason why they do that. But tomatoes are a nitrogen guzzler, so they can really rip out that nitrogen out of the soil. If you are doing like an acre, then yeah, it's worth rotating because you're dealing with a large property. When you're at a home garden and you can fertilize and you can maintain one area and it's not as expensive to, like, you can buy a bag of fertilizer and maintain a little garden area, where if you're buying fertilizer every year to grow tomatoes for a whole acre or 100 acres, that can get really expensive. So rotating can maybe be more practical on a bigger scale kind of thing. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So do you, if you're not gonna rotate them, you make sure like you put Harvest Supreme or something on it every year?
Yeah, you'll definitely want to amend your soil every year if you don't. Like things like tomatoes, they can really take up a lot of nitrogen.
Well, and
So-
as you mentioned at the very beginning, doing a pea crop and then using that green mulch back in that
Yep.
soil will reintroduce nitrogen.
Yep, you can do that pea crop in the spring, or a cover crop kind of thing is kind of what that is, to kind of help mitigate some of those issues. So like rotating is a tool. If you end up having some problems, like that's one of my first things to recommend is like, just don't plant there. Allow that soil to heal from that disease that is attracted to tomatoes and plant something else there. But then but if you're not having problems, then it's not a big deal, but you might eventually, there's a farm that's nearby that does pumpkins for October for like a pumpkin patch. And I was talking with them and they say that they have to rotate. They can get about 2-3 years in one area before powdery mildew is just too rampant in that field to do a third or fourth crop. And so they can get it 2, maybe 3 years before they have to relocate, or else they end up having a lot of powdery mildew issues. So yeah. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you for coming. I hope we have other classes down the road. So yeah.
Perfect timing too.